The rain hammered the metal roof of Murphy's livestock auction like bullets, and Jake Sullivan clutched his last 2 quarters like they were diamonds. 3 months ago, he'd been a successful investment banker with a corner office and a 7-figure portfolio. Now, thanks to a market crash and some spectacularly bad decisions, he was homeless, broke, and watching farmers bid on animals he couldn't afford to feed himself. That's when he saw her. A tiny, trembling foal barely the size of a large dog, ribs showing through her dull coat. The auctioneer was practically giving her away. 50 cents! Do I hear 50 cents for this little filly? Jake's hand shot up before his brain could stop him. What was a former Wall Street hotshot doing buying a dying horse with grocery money? He had no land, no barn, no clue about horses. But something in her dark eyes reminded him of himself, lost, abandoned, written off by everyone. What Jake couldn't know was that this scraggly little foal carried bloodlines worth millions, and her story would change both their lives forever, but would she survive long enough to prove her worth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gavel came down with a decisive crack that echoed through the sparse crowd. Sold to the gentleman in the back for 50 cents. Jake stared at his empty palm, then at the foal who was now inexplicably his. The other bidders, mostly weathered farmers in worn denim, turned to look at him with expressions ranging from amusement to pity. He didn't blame them. In his wrinkled dress shirt and torn slacks, clutching a receipt for 50 cents, he probably looked like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. "You coming to collect your purchase, son?" The auctioneer's voice boomed over the microphone, tinged with skepticism. "She ain't gonna walk herself out." Jake made his way down through the bleacher-style seating, his stomach churning with equal parts panic and something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe? Or just the delayed shock of his spectacular fall from grace finally catching up with him. The holding pen was tucked behind the main arena, a cramped space that smelled of hay, manure, and something else. Desperation, perhaps. The foal stood in the corner, legs splayed wide to keep herself upright, her breathing shallow and labored. Up close, she looked even worse. Her coat was a muddy brown color that might have been bay under better circumstances, and her mane hung in limp tangles. "She's a real beauty, ain't she?" The pen attendant, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, chuckled as he approached with a lead rope. "Can't imagine why nobody wanted her. What's wrong with her?" Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Could be anything. Malnutrition, worms, pneumonia, take your pick. Found her abandoned in a field outside Millerville. Owner went belly up and just left everything behind." The man shrugged as if abandoned livestock was just another Tuesday. "You got transportation for her? Or you need me to call someone?" "Transportation." Jake almost laughed. He'd been sleeping in his car for the past week, surviving on gas station coffee and whatever free samples he could find at the grocery store. He had no transportation for a horse, no money for veterinary care, and absolutely no plan beyond the next few hours. "I'll figure something out," he said, though he had no idea how. The attendant raised an eyebrow but handed over the lead rope without comment. "She's your problem now. Good luck." Jake approached the foal slowly, the way he might approach a skittish investor during a bad market day. "Hey there, girl," he said softly. "Looks like we're both in a pretty rough spot." The foal lifted her head as he got closer, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were dark brown, almost black, with an intelligence that seemed far too old for such a young animal. She didn't pull away when he clipped the lead rope to her halter, if the tangled mess of leather around her head could even be called that. "What am I doing?" Jake muttered to himself as he led her toward the exit. The rain had intensified, turning the gravel parking lot into a muddy obstacle course. His car, a 10-year-old sedan that had seen better days even before he'd started living in it, sat alone under a flickering streetlight. The absurdity of the situation hit him all at once. Here he was, a man who once managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, trying to figure out how to fit a horse into a Honda Civic. If his former colleagues could see him now, they'd probably think he'd suffered a complete mental breakdown. Maybe they'd be right. But as he stood there in the rain, watching the foal shiver beside him, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. This little horse needed him, and God knew he needed something to care about besides his own spectacular failures. "All right, girl," he said, surprising himself with his resolve. "Let's figure this out together." The foal wouldn't stop shivering, even wrapped in Marcus's old flannel shirt inside the rusty horse trailer he'd borrowed from his neighbor Pete. The drive back to his ramshackle property felt longer than the journey to the auction, every pothole sending a jolt of worry through him as he checked the rearview mirror. What the hell had he been thinking? His ranch was a generous term for the 5 acres of overgrown pasture and a sagging barn that came with the foreclosed house he'd been squatting in for the past month. The bank hadn't bothered to kick him out yet, probably because the place was worth less than the paperwork involved. Now he was bringing home a dying horse to his dying dream of a life. Marcus parked next to the barn and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the trailer's gaps, he could hear the foal's labored breathing. At least she was still breathing. "All right, girl," he said, climbing out. "Welcome to paradise." The trailer door protested with a screech of rusted hinges. Inside, the foal lay curled in a corner, her dark eyes tracking his movements, but her body too weak to lift her head. She was even smaller than he'd remembered, no bigger than a large dog, with a coat that should have been glossy black but looked dull as charcoal. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Marcus slid his arms under her carefully, surprised by how light she was, all bones and loose skin. She didn't fight him, which worried him more than if she'd struggled. The barn smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but it was dry. Marcus had been using it as storage for the few possessions he'd managed to salvage from his old life: a moldy couch, boxes of water-damaged books, and a camping sleeping bag that had seen better decades. He cleared out a corner stall and spread the sleeping bag on the ground, then gently placed the foal on top. She tried to lift her head again, managed it for a few seconds, then gave up with a soft whicker that sounded almost like a sigh. "I know, baby, I know." Marcus knelt beside her, his hand hovering uncertainly over her neck. He'd never owned so much as a goldfish, let alone a horse. "We're both pretty pathetic, aren't we?" The sun was setting, painting the barn in orange shadows. Marcus realized he had no idea what to feed a sick foal, or any foal for that matter. Hell, he barely knew what to feed himself most days. His phone, an ancient flip model that somehow still worked, buzzed in his pocket. Pete's number. "You get that nag home all right?" Pete's voice crackled through the speaker. "Yeah, we made it." Marcus glanced at the foal, whose breathing seemed to be getting shallower. "Pete, you know anything about horses?" "Enough to know you're an idiot." A pause. "But since you asked, that little thing's gonna need milk. Horse milk, ideally, but mare's milk replacer from the feed store'll do. Problem is, Murphy's farm supply closed an hour ago." Marcus's heart sank. "What about regular milk? You trying to kill her faster?" "No, dummy. Look, I got some emergency foal formula left over from when my neighbor's mare rejected her baby last spring. I'll bring it by." "Pete, I can't pay you back right now." "Shut up, Marcus. Just shut up." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, Pete's pickup rumbled up the drive. The older man climbed out carrying a bag of supplies, shaking his head at the barn. "This place is falling down. It's got character. Character don't keep the rain out." Pete knelt next to the foal, running experienced hands over her body. "She's in rough shape, but I've seen worse pull through." "What'd you name her?" Marcus blinked. "I haven't." "Well, you better. Can't save something that don't have a name." Marcus studied the foal's face. Despite her condition, there was something alert in her dark eyes, a spark that reminded him of Penny, he said suddenly. "Penny? Because she cost 50 cents, and because—" Marcus trailed off, embarrassed by the sentiment. Because she's all I got left. Like finding a penny when you're broke. It's not much, but it's something. Pete mixed the formula in a bottle, testing the temperature on his wrist like a new father. All right, Penny, let's see if you want to stick around. It took patience and gentle coaxing, but eventually the foal latched onto the bottle. The sound of her suckling filled the quiet barn, and for the first time all day, Marcus felt something that might have been hope. She's got fight in her, Pete observed, packing up his supplies. Question is, do you? Marcus watched Penny drain the bottle, her tail giving the tiniest twitch of satisfaction. Ask me tomorrow. The $50 registration fee might as well have been $50,000. Frank sat on the rickety porch of his rented trailer, staring at the crumpled notice from the Quarter Horse Association, while the foal grazed on the few patches of decent grass in his postage stamp yard. 3 days had passed since the auction, and reality was setting in harder than a hangover. You know what your problem is, Kowalski? His neighbor Margie hollered over the chain-link fence, cigarette dangling from her lips. You think too damn small. Frank looked up from the paper. Margie was hanging laundry with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for 60-odd years, her grey hair wrapped in curlers that had probably been there since the Carter administration. How's that? Registration fees got you spooked, but you're sitting on a gold mine and don't even know it. She snapped a bedsheet with military precision. My late husband, Earl, God rest his soul, used to train horses for the Hendersons up on Mill Creek Road. Richest family in 3 counties, and dumber than a box of rocks when it comes to anything that ain't money. The foal wandered closer to the fence, her coat already looking shinier after just a few days of regular feeding. Frank had been splitting his meager groceries with her, figuring they were both in the same boat anyway. What's your point, Margie? My point is, Mrs. Henderson's been looking for a project horse for her granddaughter. Something to keep the kid busy this summer. Margie lowered her voice conspiratorially. That woman drops more money on her weekly manicure than you make in a month. Frank considered this, watching the foal attempt to investigate a butterfly that had landed near her nose. The little horse still moved carefully, but there was something different about her today, a spark that hadn't been there at the auction. Even if that's true, I can't afford to register her, and no rich lady's going to want an unregistered horse. Who said anything about selling? Margie cackled. You lease training rights. Let them pay for the registration, the feed, the vet bills, everything. You keep ownership, they get to play horse trainer for the summer. Everybody wins. The idea was so simple it was either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both. Frank had learned enough about horses from his father to know the basics, but training? That was a different animal entirely. I don't know the first thing about training horses, Margie. Neither do they. That's the beauty of it. She pinned up a pair of floral house dresses that looked older than the trailer park itself. Besides, that little girl's got good instincts. I seen her watching you work with the foal yesterday. Frank hadn't noticed anyone watching, but then again, he'd been completely absorbed in trying to get the foal to trust him enough to let him check her hooves. It had taken 45 minutes and half a bag of apple slices, but she'd finally cooperated. Even if Mrs. Henderson was interested, how am I supposed to approach her? Excuse me, rich lady, want to rent my half-dead horse? Leave that to me. Margie's grin revealed teeth stained by decades of coffee and tobacco. I clean their house twice a week. Been listening to that woman complain about her granddaughter moping around all summer. Kid's 15. Doesn't want to go to camp. Too cool for family vacations. A horse project might be exactly what she needs. The foal had given up on the butterfly and was now attempting to eat Frank's bootlace through the fence. He gently extracted his foot and scratched behind her ears, marveling at how much weight she'd already gained. What would I even call her? Can't very well introduce her as the 50-cent horse. Names are important, Margie agreed, stubbing out a cigarette on the fence post. Got to be something with class, something that suggests potential. Frank studied the foal's delicate features, the way she held her head with an almost regal bearing despite her humble circumstances. There was something about her that reminded him of the old westerns his father used to watch, stories about underdogs who surprised everyone. Liberty, he said suddenly. Her name's Liberty. Margie nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like a businessman. Liberty's got a nice ring to it, patriotic, appeals to the upper-class sensibilities. The foal looked up at the sound of her new name, ears pricked forward with interest. For a moment, Frank could swear she understood exactly what was happening. "So, what do you think, Liberty?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Ready to meet some rich folks?" Liberty snorted softly and returned to investigating his bootlaces, apparently unimpressed by the prospect of mingling with the local aristocracy. Frank couldn't blame her. He wasn't entirely convinced this wasn't just another way to spectacularly fail. But then again, spectacular failure was starting to look like his specialty anyway. The sunrise found Marcus sitting on an overturned milk crate in the makeshift stall he'd cobbled together from scrap plywood and chicken wire. His back ached from sleeping on the barn floor, but he'd positioned himself where he could keep watch over the foal through the night. She was standing now, which seemed like a minor miracle given her condition 12 hours earlier. "Well, girl, I suppose we both survived the night," he murmured, extending his palm with a handful of oats he'd borrowed from a neighboring stall. The foal approached cautiously, her legs still unsteady but showing more strength than yesterday. When her soft muzzle touched his hand, something shifted in Marcus's chest, a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed. The barn door creaked open, and Hank ambled in carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Figured you might need this more than sleep," he said, offering one to Marcus. The warmth spread through Marcus's fingers as he wrapped them around the chipped ceramic mug. "She's better today," Marcus said, nodding toward the foal who was now investigating a hay net with cautious interest. Hank leaned against the stall door, studying the small horse. "Color's improved, that's for sure, though she's still nothing but skin and bones wrapped in a dull coat." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Doc Miller's coming by this morning to check on the Armstrong's prize bull. I could ask him to take a look at your girl if you want." Marcus's stomach clenched. "I appreciate it, but I can't afford a vet bill right now." The admission stung, but there was no point in pretending otherwise. "Didn't say anything about payment," Hank replied gruffly. "Miller owes me a favor or two." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced someone's arrival. Through the barn's open door, they watched a weathered pickup truck pull into the yard, followed by a sleek silver sedan that looked distinctly out of place among the farm equipment. "That's odd," Hank muttered. "Don't recognize the fancy car." 2 figures emerged from the sedan, a woman in an expensive-looking blazer and a man carrying what appeared to be official documents. They approached the barn with purpose, their city shoes unsuited for navigating the muddy farmyard. "Excuse me," the woman called out as she entered the barn, her nose wrinkling slightly at the agricultural aromas. "I'm looking for a Marcus Webb." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. Debt collectors, probably. Or maybe someone from the bank, though he thought he'd already lost everything they could legally take. "That's me." The woman's expression softened slightly when she saw his appearance, the rumpled clothes he'd slept in, the stubble, the general air of a man who'd hit bottom and kept digging. "Mr. Webb, I'm Sarah Chen from the law offices of Morrison, Chen and Associates. This is my colleague, David Park. We've been trying to locate you regarding your late uncle's estate." Marcus blinked. "My uncle? I don't have any uncles, at least none that I know of." "Theodore Webb," she continued, consulting her papers. "He passed away 6 months ago in Oregon. According to our records, you're his sole surviving relative." The name stirred something in Marcus's memory. Family stories his mother had told him about her brother who disappeared when Marcus was young, chasing some dream out west. "Teddy, but he vanished years ago. My mom thought he was probably dead." "He was very much alive until recently," Sarah Chen said. "He owned a small farm outside Portland, raised horses actually, quarter horses mostly, but he had some thoroughbreds too." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. "Horses?" "Among other things. The estate is fairly modest, the farm itself, some equipment, a small savings account, but there's also a rather unusual collection of horse breeding records and bloodline documentation. Mr. Webb seemed quite passionate about preserving certain genetic lines." Hank had moved closer during this exchange, his weathered face showing keen interest. What kind of bloodlines? He asked. David Park opened a folder and pulled out several certificates. Champion racing stock, mostly. Some of the documentation goes back 3 generations. It appears Theodore Webb had an eye for identifying potential in horses that others overlooked. Marcus's gaze drifted to the foal, who had wandered closer to the stall door and was watching the proceedings with bright, curious eyes. I don't understand. Why now? Why didn't anyone contact me when he died? The estate went through probate, Sarah explained. Your uncle left specific instructions that you only be contacted if certain conditions were met. Frankly, his lawyer thought the conditions were rather eccentric, but they were legally binding. What conditions? Sarah Chen smiled for the first time since arriving. That you demonstrate a commitment to caring for horses in need. Apparently your uncle had very specific ideas about character and worthiness. The foal chose that moment to nicker softly, pressing her nose against Marcus's shoulder. He reached up to stroke her neck, feeling the slight tremor that still ran through her small frame. How did you find me here? He asked quietly. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the barn's weathered boards, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Jack sat on an overturned milk crate, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching Luna nibble at the fresh hay he'd spread in her stall. 3 days had passed since the auction, and the little filly had already begun to show signs of improvement. Her coat, though still dull, had lost some of its matted appearance, and her eyes held a spark that hadn't been there before. Well, would you look at that? Jack murmured as Luna lifted her head and actually looked at him with interest rather than fear. Starting to trust old Jack, are you? The sound of gravel crunching under tires made him glance toward the barn entrance. A dusty pickup truck pulled into the yard, and Jack's stomach dropped when he recognized the vehicle. Bob Henley, his landlord, climbed out with the deliberate movements of a man on an unpleasant mission. "Morning, Jack," Bob called out, his voice carrying that careful politeness that preceded bad news. "Bob." Jack stood, brushing hay from his jeans. "Little early for a social call, isn't it?" Bob's weathered face creased into an uncomfortable grimace. "Wish it was social, Jack. We need to talk." They walked to the fence line, away from Luna's curious ears. Bob leaned against a fence post and removed his baseball cap, running his fingers through his thinning hair. "County's been breathing down my neck about the back taxes on this place," Bob began. "I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to ask you to find somewhere else to stable that horse. Can't afford to have any complications right now." Jack felt his chest tighten. "How long do I have? End of the week?" "I'm sorry, Jack. I really am. If things were different." After Bob left, Jack slumped against the fence, watching Luna graze in the small paddock. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd finally found something worth caring about, and now he was about to lose it too. He had maybe $30 to his name, certainly not enough to pay for boarding at any of the commercial stables in the area. "Rough morning?" Jack turned to find Dr. Martinez approaching with her medical bag. He'd asked her to come by for a follow-up examination, though now he wondered if he'd just be wasting her time. "Getting evicted," Jack said simply. "Well, Luna is anyway. Bob needs us gone by Friday." Sarah Martinez set down her bag and studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see more than most people wanted to reveal. "Where will you take her?" "Working on it," Jack lied. Dr. Martinez approached Luna's paddock, and Jack was amazed to see the filly actually move toward the fence instead of shying away. The vet's hands moved expertly over Luna's body, checking her legs, listening to her breathing, examining her eyes and mouth. "She's gained weight," Dr. Martinez observed. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Her respiratory issues have cleared considerably." "Glad to hear something's going right," Jack muttered. As if sensing his mood, Luna wandered over to where Jack stood, and for the first time since he'd brought her home, deliberately nudged his shoulder with her nose. The gesture was so unexpected and gentle that Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She's bonded to you," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "That's not something that happens overnight. especially with a horse that's been through what she has. Yeah, well, bonds don't pay for feed and boarding. Dr. Martinez packed up her equipment in thoughtful silence. As she prepared to leave, she paused at her truck. You know, I've got a client about 20 miles north of here, Emma Hartwell. She runs a small rescue operation, takes in horses that need rehabilitation. Might be worth a conversation. I can't afford to pay for professional care. Emma's different. Sometimes she makes arrangements that don't involve cash up front. Dr. Martinez climbed into her truck, then rolled down the window. Tell her I sent you. And Jack, don't give up on this horse. I've been treating animals for 15 years, and there's something special about this one. After the vet left, Jack spent the afternoon making phone calls from his ancient landline. Most of the stables he contacted either had waiting lists or wanted deposits he couldn't afford. By evening, Emma Hartwell was his only remaining option. Luna seemed to sense his anxiety. She stayed close to the fence as he went about his evening chores, following his movements with alert ears. When he finally sat down on his milk crate to think, she stretched her neck over the fence and rested her chin near his shoulder. "What do you think, girl?" Jack asked, scratching behind her ears. "Ready for another adventure?" Luna's soft whinny sounded almost like agreement. For the first time all day, Jack allowed himself to smile. Maybe Dr. Martinez was right. Maybe Luna was special. And maybe, just maybe, special horses created their own kind of luck. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift pasture as Jake stood with his coffee, watching Penny graze on the patchy grass. 3 weeks had passed since he'd brought her home, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Her ribs no longer showed, her coat had taken on a healthy sheen, and most importantly, there was life in her eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gruff voice behind him. Jake turned to see Harold Beckett, the neighboring rancher whose property bordered his small lot. Harold was everything Jake wasn't: successful, respected, and the owner of 3 prize-winning quarter horses. His weathered face bore the kind of deep tan that only came from decades under the Texas sun. "Morning, Harold," Jake said, trying to keep the wariness out of his voice. Harold had made his opinions about Jake's foolish purchase abundantly clear during their previous encounters at Murphy's feed store. Harold approached the fence, his keen eyes studying Penny with the practiced gaze of someone who'd been around horses his entire life. "That the same scraggly thing you bought at Williamson's auction? That's her." Jake couldn't help the note of pride that crept into his voice. "Ah." Harold was quiet for a long moment, watching as Penny lifted her head, ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. "She's filled out some, Jake agreed, though privately he thought it was an understatement. Harold's expression shifted, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the older man looked almost impressed. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Jake hesitated. Harold Beckett knew more about horses than anyone in 3 counties. If there was something wrong with Penny that Jake had missed, Harold would spot it in seconds. But if there was something right with her— "Sure," Jake said, opening the gate. Harold stepped into the pasture with the confident ease of someone completely comfortable around large animals. Penny watched his approach but didn't retreat. Instead, she took a few tentative steps toward them, her natural curiosity overcoming any lingering wariness. "Easy, girl," Harold murmured, extending his hand palm up. Penny sniffed delicately, then allowed him to stroke her neck. Harold's hands moved with professional efficiency, checking her legs, examining her conformation, running his fingers along her back and shoulders. Jake held his breath, waiting for the verdict. "Jake," Harold said slowly, not taking his eyes off Penny, "where exactly did you say you got this filly?" "Williamson's auction." "Why? And nobody else bid on her?" "Nobody. I got her for 50 cents. Jake's stomach began to churn. "Harold, what is it?" Harold straightened up, his face a mask of concentration. "This filly's got bloodlines." "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at that neck, the way she carries herself, the bone structure." Harold gestured to Penny's legs. "These aren't common stock legs, Jake. This is quality breeding. Jake felt his world tilt slightly. Are you saying she's valuable? I'm saying she might be more than valuable. Harold pulled out his phone. There's someone I need to call. You mind if I take a few pictures? Before Jake could answer, Harold was already snapping photos from multiple angles. Penny, ever the cooperative subject, seemed to sense the attention and actually posed, lifting her head regally and arching her neck. Show off, Jake muttered, but he was grinning. Harold spent several minutes on his phone, speaking in low tones with someone on the other end. Jake caught fragments, distinctive markings, unusual for the area, need to check the registry. Finally, Harold hung up and turned to Jake with an expression somewhere between amazement and disbelief. Jake, I just sent those photos to a friend of mine who specializes in bloodline research. Based on Penny's markings alone, he thinks she might be related to some very expensive horses. How expensive? The kind where people pay 6 figures just for breeding rights. Jake felt like he might need to sit down. 6 figures? Harold, that's impossible. She was at a livestock auction, half dead. Nobody wanted her. Sometimes the best things end up in the wrong places, Harold said. Sometimes people don't know what they're looking at. He paused, studying Jake carefully. Question is, what are you planning to do about it? Jake looked at Penny, who had wandered over to investigate his coffee mug with typical equine curiosity. The filly who had been discarded, forgotten, left to die. This same filly might be worth more money than Jake had ever dreamed of possessing. But as he watched her gentle exploration of his morning routine, all he could think about was how she'd looked that first night, trembling and afraid in his small shelter, how she'd gradually learned to trust him, how her soft wicker of greeting had become the best part of his day. I'm going to take care of her, Jake said finally, same as I've been doing. Harold nodded approvingly. Good answer. But Jake, yeah? You might want to invest in some better fencing. If I'm right about this filly, you're going to have visitors. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift paddock, as Jake watched Penny nibble at the grass with increasing confidence. 3 weeks had passed since the auction, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where once stood a trembling skeletal foal, now grazed a spirited young horse with glossy chestnut coat and bright, intelligent eyes. Well, I'll be damned, muttered old Pete from the fence rail, his weathered hands gripping the wood as he studied Penny's movement. That little gal's got some serious athleticism hiding under all that previous neglect. Jake couldn't help but grin as Penny suddenly burst into a playful gallop, her legs moving with surprising grace and power. She'd been doing that more often lately. These spontaneous displays of joy that made his chest tight with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Doc Martinez wasn't kidding about her bloodline, Jake said, still marveling at the veterinarian's revelation from the previous week. Apparently, Penny's sire was Midnight Thunder, a champion racehorse whose offspring was selling for tens of thousands at prestigious auctions. How she'd ended up half dead at a backwater livestock sale remained a mystery, but Jake wasn't one to question good fortune when it finally decided to visit. The sound of tires crunching on gravel interrupted his thoughts. A sleek black sedan pulled up the dirt road, looking as out of place as a tuxedo at a barn dance. Jake's stomach knotted as he recognized the passenger stepping out, Marcus Steinberg, a prominent horse trainer, whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Mr. Morrison? Steinberg approached with the calculated confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His expensive suit somehow remained spotless despite the dusty surroundings. I believe we need to talk. Jake's protective instincts flared as Steinberg's eyes locked onto Penny. Depends on what you want to talk about. That filly. Steinberg gestured toward Penny with a manicured hand. I represent certain interests who are very eager to acquire her. I'm prepared to offer you $25,000 cash today. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $25,000 would solve every problem he had. The overdue rent, the empty refrigerator, the constant gnawing worry about his next meal. It would give him a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his life from something other than the rubble of poor decisions and bad luck. Old Pete whistled low. That's serious money, Jake. But as Jake watched Penny prance around the paddock, something twisted in his gut that had nothing to do with hunger. She trusted him. For the first time in her short life, she felt safe, loved, cared for. The thought of loading her into a stranger's trailer, of watching those bright eyes fill with confusion and betrayal, made his throat close up. "She's not for sale," Jake heard himself say, the words surprising him with their firmness. Steinberg's eyebrows rose. "Perhaps you didn't hear me correctly. 25,000. That's more money than most people see in a year." "I heard you fine." Jake stepped closer to the fence, his body language making his position clear. "And my answer's still no." 40,000. The trainer's voice remained steady, but Jake caught a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "That's my final offer. You'd be foolish to refuse." The word foolish hung in the air like a challenge. Jake had been called worse things, usually with good reason. He'd made more bad decisions than he could count, lost more opportunities than he cared to remember. By any rational measure, refusing this offer was just another item for that long list of regrets. But as Penny trotted over to the fence, nickering softly and nudging his hand with her velvet nose, Jake realized something important. Not all decisions needed to be rational. Sometimes the heart had to override the spreadsheet. "Thanks for the offer," Jake said, scratching behind Penny's ears. "But she stays with me." Steinberg's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Morrison. That horse has the potential to earn millions on the track. You're a nobody with nothing, living in a borrowed paddock behind a gas station. What can you possibly offer her?" Jake looked at Penny, really looked at her. She gazed back with complete trust, no fear, no hesitation. Despite everything that had been done to her before, she'd chosen to believe in him. Maybe that was worth more than all the prize money in the world. "I can offer her a home," Jake said simply. "Someone who sees her as more than just a commodity." Steinberg shook his head in disgust, muttering something about sentimental fools as he stalked back to his sedan. The car disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving behind only the afternoon breeze and the sound of Penny's contented munching. Old Pete chuckled. "Boy, you just turned down more money than most folks dream of." Jake smiled, watching his 50-cent miracle graze peacefully in the fading light. "Yeah, I did." The morning sun painted everything gold as Marcus led Star toward the practice track, her breath visible in small puffs in the crisp air. 3 weeks had passed since their first official race, and the modest purse had been enough to secure proper training time at Millfield's facilities. Star had filled out considerably, her ribs no longer visible beneath her glossy coat, but she still looked like a child among the seasoned thoroughbreds warming up around them. "You sure about this?" Jake Martinez called out from atop Thunder's Dream, a imposing bay stallion that had won his last 4 races. "That little mare's gonna get trampled out there." Marcus patted Star's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. "She's tougher than she looks." The track, buzzing with pre-race energy, reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with racing in the first place. Before his world had crumbled, before the debts and the divorce and the slow spiral downward, he'd been part of this world. Now he stood on the outside looking in, armed with nothing but hope and a horse that most people still saw as a lost cause. Dr. Sarah Chen approached, her medical bag in hand and her expression serious. "How's she feeling today?" "Like she wants to fly," Marcus replied, watching Star's ears prick forward as she studied the track. Sarah ran her hands along Star's legs, checking for heat or swelling. "Her muscle development is remarkable for such a short training period. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes. "But remember, she's still young. Don't push too hard too fast." The warning was well-intentioned, but Marcus could see the fire in Star's eyes. She wasn't just ready, she was eager. When they'd first brought her to the track, she'd been nervous, overwhelmed by the sights and sounds. Now she pulled against her lead rope, wanting to join the other horses already galloping in the distance. "Easy, girl," Marcus murmured, but he was smiling. He'd seen that look before in champions, that mixture of confidence and barely contained energy that separated the good from the great. Harold Jameson emerged from the shadows near the stable block, his expensive suit looking out of place in the earthy environment of the backstretch. He'd been sniffing around for the past week, ever since Star had turned in a surprisingly fast workout time that had caught the attention of several racing publications. "Marcus, my friend," Harold's voice carried the false warmth of a man who'd never met a deal he couldn't exploit. "I've been thinking about our conversation." There had been no conversation. Harold had made an offer, a substantial one, to buy Star outright, no questions asked. The money would have solved all of Marcus's immediate problems and left him with enough to start over somewhere else. But every time he looked at Star, he knew he couldn't do it. This wasn't about money anymore, if it ever had been. Still not interested, Harold. "But consider the practical aspects," Harold pressed, falling into step beside them as they headed toward the saddling area. "You're betting everything on one race, with a horse that hasn't proven herself against real competition. I'm offering security, a guaranteed return on your investment." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face the man. "Some things aren't for sale." Harold's smile faltered slightly. "Everything is for sale, Marcus. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Before Marcus could respond, Star stepped between them, her ears pinned back and her head lowered slightly. It wasn't aggressive exactly, but it was clear she didn't appreciate Harold's tone. The message was unmistakable, and Harold took a step backward. "Seems like the lady has made her feelings clear," came a gravelly voice from behind them. Ben Rodriguez approached with the saddle over his arm, his weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. He was one of the most respected jockeys still riding, despite being well past his prime, and he'd agreed to ride Star based on nothing more than gut instinct and Marcus's earnest plea. "Ben," Harold nodded curtly. "I trust you'll ride sensibly today. No point risking injury on a horse that's clearly in over her head." Ben's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I've been riding since before you knew which end of a horse was which, Harold. I think I can manage." As Harold stalked away, Ben began preparing Star for the race. His hands were gentle but efficient, and Marcus noticed how Star responded to the older man's calm confidence. They'd only worked together a few times, but there was already an understanding between horse and rider that couldn't be taught. "She's ready," Ben said quietly, checking the girth one final time. "Question is, are you?" Marcus looked at Star, her coat gleaming in the morning light, her eyes bright with anticipation. 3 months ago, she'd been barely clinging to life in a cramped stall. Now she stood like a queen, every inch of her radiating potential. "We're ready," he said, and for the first time in months, he truly believed it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift training track as Jake watched Penny trot in lazy circles, her coat gleaming with health that seemed impossible just months ago. The sickly foal he'd rescued was transforming daily, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial about her potential. "She's holding back," muttered old Pete, leaning against the fence rail with his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "Can't you see it in her eyes? That filly's got secrets." Jake squinted at Penny, trying to see whatever Pete was seeing. To him, she looked like a horse. A beautiful, healthy horse, but still just a horse. What kind of secrets can a horse have? "The expensive kind," Pete chuckled. "Hand me that lead rope. Time for some real education." What followed was the strangest training session Jake had ever witnessed. Pete didn't focus on speed or endurance like Jake expected. Instead, he walked Penny through a series of movements that looked almost like a dance. Precise steps, calculated pauses, and turns that seemed to flow like water. "What exactly are you teaching her?" Jake asked, scratching his head as Penny executed a perfect figure 8 that would have made a dressage instructor weep. "I'm not teaching her anything," Pete replied, his voice carrying a note of wonder. I'm reminding her what she already knows. As if to prove his point, Penny suddenly broke into the most elegant canter Jake had ever seen. Her movements were so fluid, so naturally graceful, that several other horse owners stopped their morning routines to stare. She wasn't just running, she was performing. "Sweet mother of pearl," whispered Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who'd been checking on a neighboring horse. "Is that the same filly you brought in half-dead 3 months ago?" Jake nodded, still mesmerized by Penny's transformation. "Pete thinks she's got some kind of special bloodline." Sarah pulled out her phone and started recording. "Jake, I've seen thousands of horses in my career. This level of natural movement, this instinctive grace, it doesn't just happen. She's either been professionally trained, which is impossible given her age, or she's got championship genetics running through her veins." The implications hit Jake like a freight train. "You're saying she might actually be worth something?" "Worth something?" Sarah laughed, zooming in on Penny's perfect form. "If I'm right about what I'm seeing, she could be worth everything." Pete called Penny over with a simple whistle, and she responded immediately, trotting to him with the kind of eager intelligence that spoke of deep trust and understanding. He stroked her neck thoughtfully before turning to Jake with an expression that was part excitement, part concern. "Son, I need to ask you something important. That auction where you found her, do you remember anything about the seller? Any paperwork? Any mentions of where she came from?" Jake racked his brain, trying to recall details from what had been the darkest day of his life. The guy seemed nervous, kept checking his watch. "Paid in cash, left right after the sale. Why?" Pete exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah. "Because fillies with this kind of natural ability don't usually end up at backwater livestock auctions for 50 cents. Something doesn't add up." As if sensing the tension in the conversation, Penny nickered softly and nudged Jake's shoulder with her nose. He automatically reached up to scratch behind her ears, marveling at how this simple gesture had become such a source of comfort for both of them. "Whatever her story is," Jake said firmly, "she's mine now. We're a team." "That's all well and good," Sarah interjected gently. "But Jake, if she really is what I think she might be, there could be people looking for her. People with lawyers and legal claims." The thought sent ice through Jake's veins. After losing everything, his job, his house, his savings, the idea of losing Penny too was unbearable. She wasn't just a horse anymore. She was his partner, his hope, his shot at rebuilding something meaningful from the ashes of his old life. "Then we'd better make sure she's ready to prove her worth before anyone comes sniffing around," Pete said, with a determined gleam in his eye. "If she's going to be challenged, she needs to be undeniably, spectacularly undeniable." Jake felt a familiar surge of the desperate determination that had carried him through his darkest moments. "What do you have in mind?" Pete smiled, the kind of smile that promised adventure and trouble in equal measure. "There's a regional competition next month. Nothing too fancy, but it draws scouts from some of the bigger circuits. If Penny performs like I think she can, she'll announce herself to the right people on her own terms. And if she doesn't, then we'll know for sure that miracles really do come in 50-cent packages," Pete replied, giving Penny one final pat. "Either way, we'll have our answer." As Jake watched Penny graze peacefully in the afternoon light, he realized that the scared, desperate man who'd stumbled into that auction was gone. In his place stood someone ready to fight for what mattered. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift training track Jake had cleared behind Mabel's barn. 3 weeks had passed since Starlight's first official workout, and the little filly had transformed from a wobbly-legged shadow of herself into something approaching a real racehorse. Her ribs no longer showed, her coat gleamed with health, and most importantly, she'd developed an attitude that could charitably be described as spirited. "Come on, girl," Jake coaxed, holding the lead rope, as Starlight planted her hooves and refused to approach the starting gate he'd cobbled together from old fence posts and chicken wire. "It's not going to bite you." Starlight snorted and took 2 steps backward, nearly pulling Jake off his feet. For a horse that weighed barely 800 pounds, she had the stopping power of a freight train when she set her mind to it. Mabel emerged from the barn carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained amusement. "Having trouble with your champion there, Jake?" "She was perfect yesterday," Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Went right through the gate like she'd been doing it her whole life." "That's because yesterday she was tired from her long run. Today she's fresh and ornery." Mabel settled onto an overturned feed bucket, clearly prepared to enjoy the show. "Horses are like people, Jake. Some days they wake up on the wrong side of the stall." As if to prove the point, Starlight chose that moment to execute a perfect sideways dance that would have made a dressage instructor weep with joy, except for the fact that it carried her even further from the starting gate. "Maybe I should get Doc Harrison to check her over again," Jake said, though he knew the veterinarian had given Starlight a clean bill of health just 2 days prior. The old vet had actually seemed impressed by her progress, muttering something about good bones and natural athletic ability before loading his truck with Mabel's homemade cookies as payment. "Ain't nothing wrong with that horse, except she's smart enough to know when she's being asked to do something she doesn't feel like doing," Mabel observed. "Question is, are you smart enough to figure out how to change her mind?" Jake studied his stubborn filly, remembering the spark he'd seen in her eyes that first day at the auction. That spark was definitely still there, currently directed toward escaping any and all training activities. He thought about the racing form he'd been studying, memorizing bloodlines and training techniques until his eyes burned. Theory was one thing, but standing in a dusty paddock with 1,000 pounds of pure opinion was something else entirely. "All right, Miss Starlight," he said, loosening his grip on the lead rope. "Let's try a different approach." Instead of forcing her toward the gate, Jake began walking in the opposite direction, letting the rope go slack. Starlight's ears pricked forward in surprise. This wasn't part of the usual morning routine. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, curious about this new development. Jake led her in a wide circle around the paddock, gradually spiraling inward until they were passing close to the starting gate with each circuit. Starlight eyed the contraption suspiciously but continued to follow, her natural curiosity warring with her morning attitude. "Clever," Mabel called out approvingly. On the 5th pass, Jake casually guided Starlight directly through the gate opening without stopping or making a fuss about it. The filly was so focused on whatever they might be doing next that she barely seemed to notice she'd just walked through her morning nemesis. "Good girl," Jake murmured, scratching behind her ears. Starlight leaned into the attention, apparently deciding that training wasn't so bad after all. They repeated the exercise several more times, and with each pass, Starlight grew more confident. By the end of the session, she was practically dragging Jake toward the gate, eager to show off her newfound skill. "Well, I'll be damned," Mabel said, rising from her bucket. "You might actually know what you're doing." Jake felt a flush of pride, followed immediately by a wave of anxiety. Knowing what he was doing was one thing, but knowing enough to turn a 50-cent foal into a racehorse was something else entirely. Every night he fell asleep studying racing manuals and bloodline charts, and every morning he woke up feeling like he was making it up as he went along. But as he watched Starlight prance around the paddock, her tail held high and her eyes bright with intelligence and spirit, Jake felt that familiar flutter of possibility in his chest. Maybe he didn't know everything about training racehorses. Maybe he was just a down-on-his-luck handyman who'd made an impulsive decision at a livestock auction. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what this particular horse needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift training track as Jake watched Penny take her practice run. 3 weeks had passed since their disastrous debut, and the transformation was remarkable. The little mare's coat gleamed with health, her stride had lengthened into something approaching elegance, and most importantly, she no longer looked like she might collapse at any moment. "She's ready," Doc Martinez announced, folding his arms as Penny rounded the final turn with Miguel crouched low in the saddle. More than ready, actually. That filly's got fire in her belly now. Jake nodded, though his stomach churned with familiar anxiety. Tomorrow was the Riverside County Fair's amateur stakes race, their second chance at proving Penny belonged on a real track. The purse wasn't much, just $5,000, but it represented everything: vindication, hope, and maybe enough money to keep their little operation running for another month. "You sure about this jockey situation?" Sarah asked, appearing beside him with a steaming cup of coffee. She'd been coming around more often lately, helping with everything from grooming to paperwork to talking Jake off the proverbial ledge when his confidence wavered. "Miguel knows her better than anyone," Jake replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Besides, we can't afford a professional rider, and he's got good instincts." Miguel guided Penny to a gentle stop near the rail, both horse and rider breathing easily after their morning workout. The young man had thrown himself into learning everything about race riding, studying videos online, and practicing his form until his legs ached. More importantly, he and Penny had developed an almost telepathic connection. "She wants to run," Miguel called out, patting Penny's neck. "I can feel it. She's not scared anymore." That had been the breakthrough 3 weeks ago. Dr. Williams had identified the root of Penny's track anxiety. She'd been pushed too hard, too young by her previous owners, creating a fear response to racing environments. With patience, positive reinforcement, and gradually increasing exposure to race day conditions, they'd rebuilt her confidence from the ground up. "Remember what we practiced," Jake said as Miguel dismounted. "Stay patient in the early going. Let her find her rhythm before you ask for speed." "And if she starts to fade?" Miguel asked, though they'd been over this a dozen times. "Trust her. She'll tell you if she has more to give." The afternoon flew by in a blur of preparation. They loaded Penny into the borrowed trailer, gathered their meager collection of racing equipment, and made the hour-long drive to the fairgrounds. The familiar chaos of race day surrounded them, trainers barking orders, horses being led through their warm-up routines, the distant sound of the announcer calling races over the public address system. But something was different this time. Penny stepped off the trailer with her head high, ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. She surveyed her surroundings with the calm confidence of a seasoned competitor, not the trembling wreck she'd been at their first race. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Tom Jenkins, the grizzled trainer from a neighboring stall. "That the same filly you brought here last month? Looks like a completely different animal." Jake felt a surge of pride as other trainers and owners stopped to admire Penny. Word had apparently spread about the man who'd bought a dying foal for pocket change and nursed her back to health. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but all seemed impressed by the transformation. The hours before post-time crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jake found himself pacing nervously while Sarah helped Miguel get ready, adjusting his silks and offering words of encouragement. Doc Martinez ran through a final checklist, examining Penny's legs and listening to her breathing. "Riders up!" The call sent a jolt of electricity through Jake's nervous system. This was it, their second chance, their opportunity to prove that miracles could happen to those desperate enough to believe in them. Miguel swung into the saddle with practiced ease, looking every inch the professional jockey despite his inexperience. Penny danced beneath him, eager and alert but not panicked. As they made their way toward the track for the post-parade, Jake felt tears prick his eyes. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man with nothing left to lose. Now he stood at the rail of a racetrack, watching his 50-cent investment prepare to compete against horses worth thousands of times more. Win or lose, they'd already accomplished something extraordinary. "She looks beautiful out there," Sarah whispered, slipping her hand into his. The horses loaded into the starting gate with mechanical precision. Penny entered her stall calmly, standing quietly while the gate crew made their final adjustments. In the distance, Jake could see Miguel's bright yellow silks, steady and focused. The track announcer's voice boomed across the fairgrounds, "And they're off!" The starting gate sprang open, releasing 8 horses into the bright afternoon sunshine. Among them, a little brown filly who'd once been hours from death, now thundered down the track, carrying the hopes and dreams of everyone who dared to believe in second chances. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training track as Jake watched Miracle Thunder stretch her legs in what could only be described as poetry in motion. 3 months had passed since that disastrous first race, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The once sickly foal had grown into a magnificent thoroughbred, her coat gleaming like burnished copper in the early light. "She's ready," Doc Martinez announced, checking his stopwatch one final time. "Hell, she's been ready for weeks. That last quarter mile was faster than some Derby winners." Jake nodded, though his stomach churned with a familiar cocktail of excitement and terror. The Bluegrass Stakes was just 2 days away, and despite Miracle's incredible progress, he couldn't shake the memory of her stumbling out of the gate that first time. Rosa had been right to push for more training, but now even she agreed it was time to test their champion against real competition. "You worry too much, old man," Rosa said, emerging from the barn with Miracle's cooling blanket. "Look at her. She knows she's special." It was true. Miracle carried herself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, her ears pricked forward as if she were listening for the sound of trumpets announcing her arrival. She'd always been spirited, but now there was something regal about her bearing that made even seasoned horsemen stop and stare. The phone in Jake's pocket buzzed insistently. He'd been avoiding calls from reporters all week, but this number belonged to Sam Fletcher, the veteran trainer who'd taken Jake under his wing during those early fumbling weeks. "Jake, you sitting down?" Sam's voice crackled through the speaker. "Because I've got news that's going to knock your boots clean off." "What kind of news?" "The good kind. Miracle Thunder just got invited to the Kentucky Derby." Jake nearly dropped the phone. The Derby? That was impossible. They hadn't even run in a major stakes race yet, and here Sam was talking about the most prestigious race in America. "Sam, I think you've been hitting the bourbon a little early today. There's no way—" "Listen to me, you stubborn coot. Miracle's bloodline just got traced back to Secretariat on her dam's side. Turns out that sick little foal you bought for pocket change is royalty. The Racing Commission fast-tracked her nomination based on her breeding and her training times. They want her in the field." Jake sank onto a nearby hay bale, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Rosa and Doc crowded closer, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. "The Derby's in 6 weeks," Jake managed to croak. "She's never even placed in a real race." "Which is exactly why this is perfect," Sam continued. "No pressure, no expectations. She'll go off at long odds, and if she shows well, you'll have announced her arrival to the entire racing world. If she doesn't, well, she's still a baby learning the game." After hanging up, Jake stared at his small team gathered around him. 3 months ago, he'd been a broken man with 50 cents and a death wish. Now he was being invited to the Kentucky Derby. The irony wasn't lost on him. "So?" Rosa demanded. "What did Sam want?" When Jake explained, Rosa whooped with joy and threw her arms around Miracle's neck. Doc just whistled low and shook his head in amazement. But Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "We need to be smart about this," he said finally. "The Derby isn't just a race, it's a circus. Media, crowds, pressure like nothing we've experienced. Are we really ready to throw her into that?" "Are you kidding me?" Rosa's eyes flashed with indignation. "This is what we've been working toward. This is why we rebuilt the stable, why we've been pushing ourselves to the limit every single day. You can't get cold feet now." Doc nodded his agreement. "The filly's sound, Jake, physically and mentally. If anything, the big stage might suit her personality. She likes being the center of attention." As if summoned by their conversation, Miracle wandered over and nudged Jake's shoulder with her velvety nose. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved him, as if she understood far more than any horse should. In that moment, looking into those eyes, Jake made his decision. "All right," he said, standing and straightening his shoulders. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Rosa, start working on her gait training. I want her breaking clean every single time. Doc, map out a conditioning program that'll have her peaking in 6 weeks. And somebody better teach me how to tie a necktie, because apparently I'm going to Churchill Downs. The Kentucky Derby. Jake shook his head in wonder as Miracle trotted back toward her stall, tail held high like a banner. Sometimes life had a sense of humor that bordered on the absurd. The morning sun cast long shadows across the practice track as Jake watched Miracle trot in lazy circles, her coat gleaming like burnished copper. 3 weeks had passed since the county fair, and the filly had transformed from a scrawny yearling into something that made people stop and stare. Her legs had lengthened, her chest had broadened, and there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "She's getting cocky," Martha observed, leaning against the fence rail with a steaming cup of coffee. "Look at that strut. She knows she's special now." Jake chuckled, remembering the trembling, half-dead foal he'd carried home in his pickup truck. "Can't say I blame her. Fame's gone to her head." The phone in his pocket buzzed incessantly. Ever since the local newspaper ran their story, Miracle Horse Rises from Near Death, he'd been fielding calls from reporters, horse enthusiasts, and what seemed like every person with a smartphone who'd seen the viral video of Miracle's victory lap. "Mr. Henderson?" a smooth voice called from behind them. Jake turned to see a man in an expensive suit approaching, his shoes clearly not designed for barn visits. "I'm Richard Blackwood, from Blackwood Enterprises." Martha shot Jake a warning look. They'd both heard of Blackwood, a wealthy businessman who collected thoroughbreds like other people collected stamps. "Mr. Blackwood." Jake wiped his hand on his jeans before extending it. "What brings you out here?" "Your horse, naturally." Blackwood's eyes never left Miracle as she cantered past. "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. $750,000. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. Jake felt his knees wobble slightly. $750,000. Enough to pay off every debt, buy back his house, start over completely. "That's a lot of money," Jake said carefully. "Indeed it is. For a horse that cost you 50 cents, I'd say it represents quite a return on investment." Blackwood's smile was practiced, predatory. "I have the finest facilities, the best trainers. She could reach her full potential with my resources." Martha stepped closer to Jake, her presence steadying him. "And what exactly do you think her potential is?" "Racing, of course. With proper conditioning and bloodline verification, she could be running at major tracks within 2 years. The prize money alone would justify my investment." Jake watched Miracle nuzzle Dr. Fleming, who'd arrived for her weekly checkup. The vet scratched behind the filly's ears, earning a contented whinny that carried across the pasture. "She's not a racehorse," Jake said finally. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Henderson, I've seen the footage. That horse has speed, spirit, natural ability. In the right hands, she's exactly where she belongs." The words came out stronger than Jake had expected. "She's not for sale." "Perhaps you didn't hear me correctly. 750,000. I heard you fine." Jake turned to face Blackwood fully. "But you didn't hear me. She's not for sale." The businessman's facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Henderson, let's be realistic. You're living in a rented cottage, working odd jobs. This horse represents financial security for the rest of your life. Or," Martha interjected sweetly, "she represents something that can't be bought." Blackwood's gaze shifted between them, calculating. $1 million. That's my final offer." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jake could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. $1 million, life-changing money. Never worry about anything again money. But then Miracle trotted over to the fence, drawn by the voices. She stuck her head through the rails and bumped Jake's chest with her nose, leaving a smudge of dirt on his shirt. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, a trust that was absolute. "The answer's still no," Jake said, stroking her neck. "Thanks for the offer, but Miracle's home is here." Blackwood's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. Sentiment doesn't pay bills." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But some things are worth more than money." The businessman adjusted his tie with sharp, angry movements. "This isn't over, Mr. Henderson. That horse has potential that's being wasted here. Others will see that. Let them look." Jake's voice was calm but firm. "They can see her right here, where she belongs." After Blackwood left in his gleaming sedan, Martha bumped Jake's shoulder with hers. "You okay? That was a lot of money to turn down." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching Miracle graze peacefully in the afternoon light. 6 months ago, he would have taken the money without hesitation. But that was before he'd learned that some investments weren't about financial returns. "I'm good," he said finally. "Real good." Dr. Fleming joined them at the fence, her examination complete. "She's in perfect health, strong as an ox and twice as stubborn." She paused, studying Jake's face. "Something tells me you're going to need that stubbornness." The morning of the Derby arrived with all the fanfare of a 3-ring circus, and Jake felt like he was about to be shot out of a cannon. He stood in the stable area watching Miracle graze peacefully, completely oblivious to the fact that in a few hours she'd be running in front of 150,000 screaming spectators and millions more on television. "She looks good," Dr. Martinez said, running his hands along Miracle's legs one final time. "Heart rate's perfect, breathing's clear. Hard to believe this is the same filly I thought we might lose 2 years ago." Jake nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He'd barely slept, running through every possible scenario in his mind. What if she stumbled? What if the crowd spooked her? What if he'd pushed her too hard, too fast? "Stop it," Maria said, appearing at his elbow with a steaming cup of coffee. "I can hear you catastrophizing from across the stable." "I'm not." "You're doing that thing where you clench your jaw and stare into the middle distance like you're trying to solve world hunger." She pressed the coffee into his hands. "Miracle's ready. You're ready. The only question now is whether your nerves are going to survive the next few hours." Tommy bounded over, practically vibrating with excitement despite the early hour. "Jake, did you see? We made the front page of the sports section. Look." He thrust a newspaper at them, and there was Miracle's photo above the headline. "Miracle worker, long shot filly captures hearts on road to Derby." Jake stared at the image of his horse, still hardly believing any of this was real. 2 years ago he'd been sleeping in his truck, spending his last 50 cents on what everyone assumed was a lost cause. Now here they were, about to compete in the most prestigious race in America. "Mr. Morrison," a young woman with a clipboard appeared, looking slightly frazzled. "I'm with the Racing Commission. We need to go over the post-race procedures, and there are some media requests." "Media requests?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. "Well, yes. Win or lose, there's going to be significant interest in your story. The redemption angle, the 50-cent investment, the sick foal who became a Derby contender, it's quite compelling." Maria snorted. "Compelling? That's one way to put it." The woman continued reading from her clipboard, rattling off a list of requirements and protocols that made Jake's head spin. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. An hour later, as they prepared to move Miracle to the saddling area, Frank appeared looking uncharacteristically nervous. "How we doing, boss?" "Terrified," Jake admitted. "Good. Shows you care." Frank adjusted Miracle's halter with practiced hands. "You know what I keep thinking about? That first day you brought her home. Remember how she could barely stand? And now look at her." They both watched as Miracle lifted her head regally, ears pricked forward, taking in all the activity around her with calm curiosity. She'd grown into a beautiful animal, not the biggest or the most imposing, but with an undeniable presence that drew people's eyes. "She knows," Frank said quietly. "Horses always know when it's time for something important." As they led Miracle through the tunnel toward the paddock, the sound hit them like a physical force. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wall of noise that seemed to press against them from all sides. Jake's steps faltered for a moment, but Miracle never missed a beat, walking forward with the confidence of a horse who belonged exactly where she was. The paddock was a controlled chaos of horses, jockeys, trainers, and officials. Cameras flashed constantly, and Jake caught glimpses of faces he recognized from television. Famous trainers, celebrity owners, reporters he'd seen on the sports networks. "Number 12, Miracle," the announcer called, and they entered their assigned spot in the walking ring. Carlos appeared, resplendent in the blue and silver silks they'd chosen, Jake's favorite colors, though he'd been too embarrassed to admit it at the time. The jockey looked calm and focused, going over last-minute strategy with barely contained intensity. "She feels strong," Carlos said, patting Miracle's neck. "Really strong. I think she's going to surprise some people today." "Riders up!" came the call, and suddenly it was time. Jake boosted Carlos into the saddle, his hands shaking slightly. "Bring her home safe," he said, the words barely audible over the crowd noise. Carlos nodded, gathering the reins. "See you in the winner's circle." As the horses began their parade toward the track, Jake felt Maria slip her hand into his. Around them, the crowd was on its feet, the energy electric and overwhelming. Miracle pranced slightly, feeding off the excitement, her coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Whatever happens," Maria said, squeezing his hand, "you've already won." Jake watched his horse disappear into the tunnel that led to the track, carrying with her 2 years of hope, struggle, and impossible dreams. The morning sun cast long shadows across the practice track as Jake adjusted Penny's saddle for what felt like the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, he told himself, but from the 3 cups of coffee he'd downed since dawn. The Kentucky Derby was tomorrow, and sleep had become a foreign concept. "You're fussing more than a mother hen," Doc Sullivan observed, leaning against the rail with an amused expression. "That saddle's been perfect for the last 15 minutes. Jake stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Penny stood patiently, her dark eyes bright and alert, seemingly unbothered by the mounting tension that had consumed everyone around her. Over the past months, she'd transformed from that skeletal foal he'd rescued into a magnificent thoroughbred, her coat gleaming like polished mahogany in the sunlight. "I just want everything to be right," Jake muttered, checking her leg wraps for the 10th time. "This is it, Doc. This is our shot. Son, you've prepared her better than any horse I've seen in 40 years of veterinary practice. She's in peak condition, her spirit strong, and she trusts you completely. Sometimes you've got to have faith in what you've built together." Across the practice area, Maria emerged from the stable office, her usually cheerful demeanor tempered by the gravity of the moment. She'd been fielding calls from reporters all week, each one seemingly more incredulous than the last about the unlikely duo that had earned their way to Churchill Downs. "Channel 7 wants an interview at noon," she announced, clutching a clipboard to her chest. "And somehow word got out about your auction story. They're calling it the 50-cent miracle." Jake groaned. The media attention had exploded after Penny's stunning victory in the Florida Derby qualifier. What had started as a local interest piece about an underdog horse had snowballed into a national sensation. Everyone wanted to know about the broke man who'd bet everything on a dying foal and somehow made it to the most prestigious race in America. "I still can't believe we're here," Jake said, running his hand along Penny's neck. She nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture that never failed to remind him of their first meeting in that dusty auction barn. Back then, he'd been a broken man with nothing left to lose. Now, standing on the threshold of the Kentucky Derby, he felt the weight of possibility crushing down on his chest. "Believe it," came a familiar voice from behind them. Jake turned to see Tommy Rodriguez approaching, his jockey silks pristine and pressed. Over the months, the young rider had become more than just Penny's jockey. He'd become family. His initial skepticism had transformed into fierce loyalty, and his skill in the saddle had been crucial to their unlikely journey. "How's our girl feeling?" Tommy asked, approaching Penny with the easy confidence that had made him Jake's first choice, despite the protests from racing traditionalists who'd questioned hiring a relatively unknown rider for such high-stakes races. "Like she's ready to show the world what she's made of," Jake replied, though his voice carried the slight quiver of a man still struggling to believe his own words. Tommy began his pre-ride routine, checking the stirrups and familiarizing himself with the track conditions. They'd drawn post position 12, not ideal but not impossible either. The field was strong, filled with horses whose breeding papers read like royalty compared to Penny's humble origins, but Jake had learned that heart often mattered more than pedigree. "Remember what we practiced," Jake told Tommy as the jockey prepared to mount. "She likes to start steady and build. Don't let the early pace panic you. She's got a kick in those final furlongs that'll surprise everyone." Tommy nodded, his game face settling into place. "She's never let us down yet. I don't expect her to start tomorrow." As Tommy settled into the saddle, Jake felt the familiar mixture of pride and terror that had become his constant companion throughout this incredible journey. 6 months ago, he'd been sleeping in his truck, surviving on gas station coffee and day-old donuts. Now he owned a Kentucky Derby contender, had a team of people who believed in their impossible dream, and possessed something he'd thought was lost forever. "Hope. One more practice run?" Maria suggested, though her tone indicated she already knew the answer. "One more," Jake agreed, stepping back to give them room. As Tommy guided Penny onto the track, Jake marveled at the grace and power in every stride. She moved with purpose now, her early frailty replaced by the fluid motion of a natural athlete. Tomorrow, in front of hundreds of thousands of spectators and millions watching on television, this unlikely pair would compete against the best horses in the world. Win or lose, they'd already achieved something miraculous. But as Penny rounded the far turn, her stride strong and sure, Jake allowed himself to dream of something even more impossible: victory. The morning sun cast long shadows across the practice track as Jake adjusted Penny's saddle for what felt like the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about the race, but from the weight of the envelope tucked inside his jacket pocket. The DNA results had arrived yesterday, and he still hadn't found the courage to open them. "You're fiddling more than my grandmother at a church potluck," Maria observed, leading Thunder over from the trailer. The big gelding snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing the electric tension that seemed to permeate the entire fairgrounds. The Bluegrass Stakes wasn't just any race. It was the kind of competition that launched careers or ended them, the sort of event that drew scouts from major racing circuits and owners with deeper pockets than Jake had ever imagined. Prize money aside, a win here would transform Penny from a miraculous recovery story into a legitimate contender for the big leagues. "Did you see the morning odds?" Tommy jogged up, slightly out of breath, clutching a crumpled racing form. "Penny's at 12-1. Not bad for a horse that was supposed to be dog food 6 months ago." Jake winced at the casual reference to Penny's near-death experience, but Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious. The kid had appointed himself as their unofficial publicity manager, and somehow the local papers had picked up on Penny's story. Miracle Mare was the headline that seemed to follow them everywhere now. 12-1 means 11 other horses are favored over us, Jake pointed out, though he couldn't suppress a grin. "Including that monster in Stall 7. Stall 7 housed magnificent Thunder, not to be confused with Maria's Thunder, a 3-year-old thoroughbred with a pedigree longer than Jake's list of past mistakes. The horse's owner, Harrison Blackwood, had the kind of polished confidence that came from never having worried about money. He'd been circling their operation all week like a well-dressed vulture, making increasingly aggressive offers to buy Penny. "The thing about long odds," Maria said, checking her own horse's bridle, "is they make the victory that much sweeter." Penny nickered softly and bumped Jake's shoulder with her nose. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that it nearly broke his heart. She had no idea what rode on this race, not just the prize money that could secure their future, but the validation that Jake desperately needed. Validation that his instinct at that livestock auction hadn't been the desperate delusion of a broken man, but genuine recognition of something special. The envelope in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. Dr. Reynolds had been cryptic when she'd handed it over, mentioning something about interesting bloodlines and unexpected connections. Whatever was inside could change everything, or confirm that Penny was exactly what she appeared to be, a miraculous survivor with an enormous heart but no famous ancestors to justify her sudden emergence as a racing phenomenon. 5 minutes to post. The announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, cutting through Jake's spiraling thoughts. Tommy bounced on his toes like a prize fighter. "This is it! This is really it! Do you realize we're about to make history?" "We're about to run a horse race," Jake corrected, though he felt the same electric anticipation coursing through his veins. "Everything else is just noise." But even as he said it, Jake knew it wasn't true. Nothing about this moment felt ordinary. From the way Penny carried herself, head high, eyes bright, every muscle coiled with potential, to the growing crowd of spectators who'd come specifically to see the miracle mare run, everything seemed charged with possibility. Maria swung up into Thunder's saddle with practiced ease. "Whatever happens out there, Jake, you should be proud. 6 months ago, that filly couldn't walk across a paddock without collapsing. Look at her now." Jake did look, really look, and what he saw took his breath away. Penny had filled out beautifully, her coat gleaming like burnished copper in the morning light. But more than her physical transformation, there was something in her eyes, a spark of intelligence and determination that spoke to breeding that went deeper than bloodlines recorded in any registry. "Time to go," he murmured, leading Penny toward the track. The crowd noise hit them like a wave as they emerged from the tunnel. Jake had expected maybe 100 spectators for a regional stakes race, but the stands were packed. Signs reading "Go Penny" and "Miracle Mare" dotted the crowd like flowers in a meadow. Harrison Blackwood intercepted them near the paddock, his smile sharp as a blade. "Last chance, Mr. Morrison. I'm prepared to offer 300,000 right now before you risk everything on a single race." Jake didn't even slow down. "She's not for sale, Mr. Blackwood. Not today, not ever." The envelope crinkled against his chest as Penny danced sideways, eager to run. Whatever secrets it contained would have to wait. Right now, there was only the track stretching ahead and the chance to prove that miracles, once begun, had no intention of stopping. The morning of the Derby dawned crisp and clear, with just enough bite in the air to make Belle dance sideways as Jake led her from the transport trailer. 3 years had passed since that day at the auction when he'd spent his last 50 cents on a sickly foal, and now here they stood at Churchill Downs, surrounded by the most expensive thoroughbreds in the world. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, running his hand along her neck. The mare had filled out beautifully, her coat gleaming like burnished copper in the early sunlight. She was still smaller than most of the other horses, but what she lacked in size she more than made up for in heart. Sarah appeared at his elbow, clipboard in hand and nervous energy radiating from every pore. The vet cleared her for the race. "Track conditions are good, weather's holding." She paused, then grinned. "I can't believe we're actually here, Jake." Neither could he, if he was being honest. The past 3 years felt like a fever dream. After Belle's stunning victory in that first small-town race, word had spread quickly through the racing community. A series of increasingly impressive wins had caught the attention of sponsors, trainers, and eventually the racing elite. But through it all, Jake had insisted on one thing: he and Belle stayed together. "Mr. Morrison?" A young woman with a press badge approached tentatively. "Could I get a quick interview before the race?" Jake started to shake his head. He'd never gotten comfortable with the media attention. But Sarah nudged him forward. "Go on. Belle needs a few more minutes to settle anyway." The reporter's questions were predictably focused on the fairy tale aspect of their story. Local man buys dying horse for pocket change, horse becomes Derby contender. It made good copy, but Jake found himself thinking about all the parts they never got right in the articles. The sleepless nights when Belle had been colicky, the morning he'd found her with a stone bruise and thought their racing days were over, the way she'd taught him that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as disasters. "What do you think your chances are today?" the reporter asked. Jake glanced over at Belle, who was now investigating a photographer's camera bag with obvious intent to cause mischief. "I think we'll give them a race they won't forget." As post time approached, the paddock filled with a combination of serious-faced trainers, nervous owners and jockeys going through their pre-race rituals. Tommy Gutierrez, Bell's jockey, was a seasoned rider who'd agreed to partner with them after watching Bell work out at the track. He was compact and focused, with hands gentle enough for Bell's sensitive mouth and nerves steady enough for the biggest race of the year. "She's feeling good," Tommy reported, as Jake gave him a leg up into the saddle. "Ready to run." The walk to the track felt surreal. Jake had attended the Derby as a spectator once, years ago when he'd still had money to burn on such things. Now he was walking alongside the rail as an owner, watching Bell prance and show off for the massive crowd. The other horses looked impressive. Midnight Thunder, the favourite, was a massive black colt with an intimidating presence. Royal Decree, the second choice, moved with elegant precision that spoke of careful breeding and expensive training. But Belle, Jake noticed with pride, looked like she belonged. She held her head high and stepped with the confidence of a horse who'd never doubted her own greatness, even when everyone else had. "Riders up!" The call sent a fresh wave of nerves through Jake's stomach. Sarah grabbed his arm as they headed for the owner's box, her excitement infectious despite his anxiety. "Look at that crowd," she breathed, gesturing toward the packed grandstand. 150,000 people, and they're about to watch our little 50-cent horse race for roses. The field loaded into the starting gate with surprisingly little drama. Belle settled into the number 12 post position calmly, ears pricked forward as she studied the track ahead. Jake could see Tommy leaning forward slightly, talking to her, keeping her focused and relaxed. The silence that fell over Churchill Downs in the moments before the start was profound and electric. Jake found himself holding his breath, remembering that scrawny foal who'd barely been able to stand, who'd stolen his heart with her determination to live. The starting bell rang with a clarity that cut through everything else, and 20 horses exploded forward in a thunder of hooves and a roar from the crowd that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient track. Bell broke cleanly, settling into a comfortable position about sixth from the rail as they headed into the first turn. Jake gripped the rail and watched his miracle horse begin the race of her life. The roar of 50,000 voices rose like thunder as Penny rounded the final turn, her hooves drumming against the Churchill Downs dirt in a rhythm that matched Jake's hammering heart. 6 months ago, he'd been sleeping in his truck outside the auction barn, clutching his last 50 cents and wondering if life was worth living. Now he stood in the owner's box at the Kentucky Derby, watching his miracle filly charge toward immortality. "She's gaining!" Martha shouted beside him, her weathered hands pressed against the rail. The old veterinarian who'd helped nurse Penny back to health from that sickly foal was crying openly, tears streaming down her face as she watched their girl run the race of her life. Tommy Chen, their jockey, crouched low over Penny's neck, his silks bright against her gleaming chestnut coat. Jake could see the determination in every line of the young rider's body as he urged Penny forward, asking for everything she had left in those final precious furlongs. "Come on, baby girl," Jake whispered, his voice lost in the chaos around him. "Show them what we've always known." The favourite, a massive colt named Thunder's Edge, had led for most of the race, but Penny was closing fast on the outside. With each stride, she seemed to find another gear, her legs reaching farther, her heart pumping pure liquid courage through her veins. This was the same filly who'd been too weak to stand properly that first day, whose ribs had shown through her dull coat like prison bars. "Look at her go!" bellowed Big Ed from somewhere behind them. The gruff trainer who'd initially refused to work with the hopeless case was now Penny's biggest champion, his voice hoarse from screaming encouragement. As they hit the final eighth of a mile, Penny pulled alongside Thunder's Edge. The crowd's roar reached a fever pitch, and Jake felt his knees go weak. She was actually going to do it. His 50-cent foal was about to win the most prestigious race in American horse racing. But Thunder's Edge wasn't finished. The champion bloodlines kicked in, and he found his own second wind, pulling away by half a length with a furlong to go. Jake's heart sank as he watched the gap widen. They'd come so far, overcome so much, but maybe it wasn't meant to be. Then Tommy did something unexpected. Instead of going to the whip, he leaned forward and spoke to Penny, his lips moving against her ear. Whatever he said worked like magic. Penny's ears pricked forward, and suddenly she was flying, her hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. "She's found another gear," Martha screamed. "Look at her! Just look at her!" Penny pulled even with Thunder's edge again, then inch by agonizing inch, began to edge ahead. The two horses battled down the stretch in one of the greatest duels in Derby history, neither willing to give an inch, both reaching deep into reserves that champions are made of. With 50 yards to go, Penny stuck her nose in front. With 20 yards left, she was ahead by a neck. As they flashed under the wire, there was no doubt Penny had won by a clear length, her head high, her stride still strong and true. Jake collapsed into his seat, overwhelmed by emotion. Around him, people were screaming, crying, and celebrating, but he felt suspended in a bubble of pure disbelief. It had really happened. The broken-down man and the sickly foal had just conquered the world. "We did it," Martha said, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "Jake, we actually did it!" The next few hours passed in a blur of photographers, reporters, and celebration. In the winner's circle, Penny posed like she'd been born for this moment, her coat gleaming under the camera flashes, a blanket of roses draped across her back. Tommy sat atop her with a grin that could have powered the entire Louisville grid, while Jake stood beside them in a borrowed suit that still didn't quite fit. "Mr. Morrison," a reporter called out, "what does it feel like to go from spending your last 50 cents to winning the Kentucky Derby?" Jake looked up at Penny, who turned her head to nuzzle his shoulder with the same gentle affection she'd shown as a foal. "Sometimes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the best investments aren't about money. They're about faith. Faith in something that everyone else has given up on. Faith that tomorrow can be better than today. Faith that miracles do happen, even to guys like me." As the sun set over Churchill Downs, casting long shadows across the historic track, Jake allowed himself to finally believe what his heart had been telling him for months. He wasn't the same broken man who'd walked into that auction barn. Penny hadn't just won a race. She'd saved them both, proving that sometimes the smallest bets yield the biggest returns, and sometimes the most beautiful victories come to those who refuse to give up on love.